This is the US. It may be one country, but drive across it and the whole world changes underneath you. In the Northeast, the cities are old and stacked tight. The streets are narrow, and people move fast and talk faster. Cross into the Midwest, and it flattens out into farmland and factory towns, where the winters turn brutal. Drop into the Southeast, and the air gets thick and humid. The churches fill up on Sunday, and everyone suddenly has time to talk. Head into the Southwest, and the ground turns to desert. The signs turn bilingual, and cities somehow rise out of land that should be uninhabitable. And out west, the mountains and coastline take over. The industries are brand new, and nobody seems to care what you wear or where you came from. 5 regions. Same country, same laws, same money, and yet they barely feel like the same place. These are not small differences. They're the kind of gaps you'd expect between separate nations. So how did the country end up like this? Well, it ultimately comes down to 3 things: when each region was settled, what its geography allowed, and what it built its economy on. We start in the Northeast, the smallest region by area, because that's where America itself basically started. This isn't technically the oldest region, since Jamestown and St. Augustine started in the Southeast, but it really is where colonial America truly grew, back when the British began planting colonies along the Atlantic in the 1600s. And here's the thing about building a city in the 1600s. You have no cars, no trains, no electricity. The fastest you can move is on foot, or if you're lucky, on horse. So everything has to be within walking distance, and it all has to cluster around the port, because the harbor is the only thing keeping the city alive. So buildings stacked close together to squeeze the most out of the limited land near the water. And as the cities grew, they grew upward and inward, on top of themselves. You could get from one to the next in days, not weeks. That closeness let the colonies eventually unify into a single country, after a huge war, of course. By the time the United States was founded in 1776, the East Coast already had more than 100 years of European development behind it. The institutions came early too. There were already 9 universities there, mostly Ivies, before the country gained independence. So naturally, a particular kind of society took shape here. One that was hierarchical, institutional, and traditional. Wealth piled up over generations, and status came from your family name, your education, and who you knew. To this day, the Northeast runs on old money, on finance, medicine, research, and the kind of theater and fine arts that take a century to build. You see it in the work culture, the dress code, the obsession with punctuality, a certain rigidness to how things are done. Then came the people who'd fill out those dense old neighborhoods. Through the 1800s and early 1900s, waves of Europeans poured in, many of them through Ellis Island. They packed into tight, old-world ethnic enclaves that still define cities like New York and Boston. The density led to the place being crowded, fast-moving, and direct, where people don't waste your time with small talk. There's even a running stereotype that captures it. People say the East Coast is not nice, but kind, meaning you'll get bluntness instead of a fake smile with passive aggression, and a more communitarian sense that we're all in this together even if nobody is being warm about it. It's still, in a lot of ways, more socially conservative than the West. And the weather matches the mood. 4 hard seasons swinging from blizzards to humid summers, with Atlantic storms rolling through. This is the baseline. Everything else in the country grew away from this. Now, the Southeast got started just as early, but heat and fertile lowlands sent it down a completely different road. Down there, the land was rich, the growing season was long, and that combination pulled the region toward one thing: agriculture. So instead of dense port towns, the South spread out into plantations, a sprawling agricultural economy growing cash crops and enslaved labor. Technically, it worked, for the people at the top. By 1840, Southern cotton was worth more than every other US export combined. But that one bet on cotton kept the Southeast rural and undiversified for centuries. Plantations need land, not density, so the region never urbanized the way the North did. By 1860, about 84% of the South worked in agriculture, compared to roughly 40% of the North. The South grew 2/3 of the world's cotton, but held only 13% of the country's banks. Its wealth concentrated in a small land-owning elite, and because so much of its labor force was African American, far less of the European immigration that reshaped the North ever reached the South. That same rural, low immigration character is also what made the Southeast the most religious region in the country. You see, when the Second Great Awakening, a wave of Protestant revival meetings, swept through in the early 1800s, the Baptists and Methodists exploded across the South. And they exploded precisely because the region was poor and had no big cities. You didn't need a cathedral or a trained clergy class. You just needed a preacher and a field. That fit the Southeast perfectly, which to this day has made it the most religious region of the country. At the same time, the South has the highest percentage of African Americans in the country, at 57%, and that's a huge part of what makes the region's culture distinct. So for a long time, the South was simply the poorest part of the country, which it still is today. But things got better from the 1950s because of two things: AC making the southern heat survive year-round, and cheap land. Put those two together and the South eventually began catching up to everyone else. But even as it boomed, the Southeast kept its older texture. The geography is still humid, the culture is still Bible Belt. That swath of the South where evangelical Christianity runs deep and church attendance towers over the national average. The hospitality, the slower pace, that's a region that spent centuries rural and spread out, where the church and the community were the center of life. It's where that southern hospitality comes from. Now we go to the Midwest, the part of the country that built 20th century America. This region filled in as the country pushed west out of the Appalachian Mountains, and it came in two waves. The first was for farmland. The land here was the prize. Flat, fertile, and endless, the agricultural core of the entire continent. Its population set it apart from the East Coast. After early settlers from New England and New York came waves of Germans and Scandinavians, who, unlike the poorer Irish and Italians crowding into eastern cities, headed straight for rural farmland. Drawn by the Homestead Act of 1862, granting ownership of 160 acres of land to any adult citizen who commits to farming the land for 5 continuous years. This is where the famous Midwestern nice culture comes from too. It's got two roots. The first is the settlers themselves, who brought a kind of humility, reserve, and dislike of confrontation. The second is frontier farming, where you simply couldn't survive alone. A barn raising or a harvest needed every neighbor you had, so niceness wasn't just manners, it was basically infrastructure. That's where you get the politeness, and also the passive-aggressive streak underneath it, where conflict gets buried instead of aired out. The result is a working-class, grounded, unflashy identity, the steady middle of the country. The second wave, shortly after, was from the factories. See, geography gave the Midwest another gift. The land is bordered by the Great Lakes and sits on the Mississippi River system, the biggest in North America and backbone of inland shipping. This is where the manufacturing rose. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, to name a few. They became what people called the Rust Belt, the manufacturing engine of the country, and it pulled in enormous European immigration plus arrivals from the Great Migration, the decades-long movement of roughly 6 million African Americans out of the rural South and into northern cities. They all packed into dense factory cities. US manufacturing peaked as a share of the economy back in 1953 at 28% of the GDP, and the Midwest was the heart of it. But then the industry collapsed for a multitude of reasons, and it was brutal. Detroit went from a peak of about 1.8 million people in 1950 down to roughly 640,000 by 2020, a drop of nearly half. Cleveland, Buffalo, and St. Louis saw similar losses. This is a region that built the country and has had to reinvent itself ever since. And the weather is the continental interior with no coast to soften it, the largest temperature swings in the nation, brutal, snowy winters, and hot, humid summers. Now, the Southwest is where it gets strange, because this is the region that, in my opinion, feels the youngest, the one that stayed frontier into the late 1800s and only really exploded in the mid-20th century. It's really obvious when you look at how it's built. Because it grew in the age of the car, the Southwest is basically entirely car-dependent and spread out, the opposite of a typical northeastern city. But what's funny though is that the Southwest is actually the oldest European settled region in the country. The Spanish were here around 1600, before the Puritans ever reached Massachusetts. Santa Fe is the oldest continuously functioning state capital in the US. San Antonio, El Paso, and a string of other cities were Spanish established. So why did it stay empty for so long when it was settled first? Well, the answer is the single most important fact about this entire region: water. Or rather, the lack of it. The Southwest is fundamentally a desert. It has the lowest rainfall of any region in the country, and yet today it's experiencing massive population growth. That combination is impossible without engineering. Let me explain. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas physically can't exist on their own, but they can now because we built dams and aqueducts to haul water in from somewhere else, mainly the Colorado River. The Glen Canyon Dam, finished in 1963, created Lake Powell, which helps power around 5 million people across 6 western states. Without that infrastructure, the modern Southwest simply isn't there. The indigenous peoples who lived here understood this. The Tongva, in what's now Los Angeles, sized their settlement to exactly what the local river could support, around 5,000 people. But the United States didn't care, hence the consistent water problems in the region. But the thing that truly sets the Southwest apart from every other region is its immigration story. This region borders Mexico. In fact, most of it used to even be Mexico, which makes it a defining cultural feature. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, over 100,000 Mexicans suddenly became US citizens because the border had moved over them, not the other way around. So the Latino influence is extremely heavy. It shapes the food, the language, the religion, and the identity of the Southwest in a way no other region shares. You can see it in the Pueblo Revival architecture, New Mexican cuisine, and the fact the largest reservation in the US, Navajo Nation, sits right in this region. And finally, we reach the West, the region that was settled last and hardest. To get here in the 1800s, you had to cross the entire continent on the westward trails, and that journey was brutal. Deserts, mountains, hostile terrain, months of travel, with thousands of people who attempted it never making it to the other side. So who made that trip? Well, not the people thriving back east. Not the ones with good jobs and comfortable spots in the social order. The people who went west were the ones who had reasons to leave. The misfits, the dreamers, and risk-takers. The very act of going filtered for a certain kind of person, someone who valued possibility over security. And then the gold rush supercharged it. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848, it unleashed the largest, fastest migration in US history. San Francisco went from about 800 people in 1848 to over 25,000 by 1850. People came from everywhere, including Chinese immigrants who arrived for the mines and built the first Chinatowns, giving the West a Pacific-facing, multi-ethnic mix from the very beginning. And here's the thing, most people didn't actually strike gold, but they stayed anyway, and they built the place with that same risk-taking mentality baked in. The geography out here is the most dramatic and varied in the country. Soaring mountains, deep deserts, and the Pacific coastline. The Pacific Northwest is gloomy and rainy, while down in California it's warm and Mediterranean all year round. The economy is the newest of any region. While the Northeast has old money finance, the West has tech, venture capital, and Hollywood, industries that barely existed a century ago. So naturally, the culture matches. That pioneer spirit, the idea that you can reinvent yourself, plus a live and let live tolerance that came out of diverse strangers learning to coexist in frontier towns. It's casual, liberal, individualistic, and it picks possibility over security. It's the region that still feels the youngest, because in a sense it is. The work culture matches it. Laid back, late, wear whatever you want. It's the total opposite of the Northeast stereotype. If the East Coast is not nice but kind, the West is nice but not kind. Friendlier on the surface, but more individualistic and more transient underneath. Now, to be honest, this is still a pretty broad breakup of US regions, because the reality is there's regions inside of these 5 regions that are insanely different. For example, in the West, the Pacific Northwest is a lot different to the Rocky Mountains. In the Midwest, the Great Plains is a lot different to the Great Lakes. In the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic is different to New England. And in the South, there's West-South Central, East-South Central, and the South Atlantic. But really, even these subregions can be divided further. I mean, what even is Miami at this point? So which region do you belong to? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this.